Stuff about any previous stuff or stuff to be needs more stuff. Okay, so last time we were talking about our good dead friend Homer, talking about poetry, etc. And we saw that the dead Greek poets, before they were dead, hopefully, laid out these four concepts of order. Purposeful agents, like people and the gods, random, purposeless events, stuff happens. And as we saw, this is still a point of debate, contention, discussion, investigation today, because we have, roughly put, two popular bumper sticker slogans. One is everything happens for a reason, which is a teleological, purposeful universe, which may involve, supernatural stuff like God, or may just be like Aristotle's view, some sort of purpose to it. And then the other bumper sticker being, of course, stuff happens. And again, still an important debate in science and philosophy today. Does stuff just happen, or do things happen for a reason? The Greeks, of course, had the amoral fates, which, for the most part, modern contemporary people probably don't believe in. Although people sometimes do talk about, destiny or fate, which so maybe we kind of do, but kind of don't believe in it. Then we finished up looking at the idea that this notion of objective morality comes in, because sort of the old traditional view, which is still around today, it hasn't vanished, is the idea that what is right is acting in a way beneficial to oneself and one's immediate people. For example, if you ever read the Odyssey or know the basic plot, Odysseus he's a liar. He lies and deceits, commits adultery and so forth, but he's really cunning and clever, and he gets things done. So on one hand, he's seen to be this great hero because he's very successful, but he's condemned by others because of his lying, adultery, and so forth. So we do see sort of the stirrings of objective morality. So now we turn to the beginnings of Greek science and philosophy. Now, we do have an origin story for philosophy, which will probably be retconned a few more times, just like all of our stories. But as far as we believe, and we could be wrong, because we're operating on old records and limited information, we believe that the first philosopher and scientist that we're aware of is our good dead friend Thales. He was a pretty smart guy. Also, in addition to doing what we consider philosophy today, also did science stuff, engineering stuff, etc. And again, the reason why he's credited with being the first scientist and philosopher is because he's the first person we know about. Was there someone before him? Possibly. One unfortunate thing, if you know the history of libraries and museums and knowledge in the world, is they tend to be lost. They tend, accidentally, disasters, but sometimes intentionally destroyed, like the Library of Alexandria, or accidentally destroyed, like the museum in Brazil. And so we have no idea how much we've lost, but lots of stuff. So Thales is the guy, because as far as you know, he's the guy. Could there have been someone else before him? Sure, probably. We just don't know who that was. Now what Thales did, which is what most great thinkers do, is they take ideas and information that already exists and combines it together, like the way they created Reese's peanut butter cups. Two good tastes, they go great together. Now, during this time, of course, there's a lot of social cultural interaction, and we had the Egyptians working out geometry and developing mathematics, very useful for determining where land is after the Nile floods. And we had the Babylonians, for religious purposes, doing a lot of astronomical observations. And Thales combined the two together, math plus observations. And he, in a way, kind of created science, or we consider modern science, by predicting a solar eclipse, or a lunar eclipse, rather, or whatever they call those things, not an astronomer. It's when, of course, we had one period happen recently when the moon comes between the Earth and the sun, blocking it out. Now Thales had the records, and he realized these things occurred, regularly at particular times. Did some math, predicted the time. Coincidentally, in kind of a Hollywood moment, there was a great battle going on at this moment, and then, you know, the sun is obscured by the moon, the soldiers, you know, panic, thinking the gods are upset at the bloodshed and carnage, they run off, but then there was just like, knew that was gonna happen, predicted it. And that was the beginning of science, where you take data and observations and, you know, reasoning, and you predict what's gonna happen. And since then, science has been ruling everything ever since. So what about the philosophy stuff? Well, Thales created two problems that plague us to this very day. And if anybody is going into you know, physics or philosophy, you'll have to deal with this problem. And the first one was called the problem of the one and the many. Now, one thing that people in the sciences, in physics, are looking for, and also philosophy, is the one thing that makes up everything. And there's an assumption that there's one basic thing, although you do get people who claim there's more than one basic thing. But a common view in physics is there's got to be one thing that makes up everything, or maybe a few things that make up everything. And the idea would be, metaphorically speaking, if you had a sword that could cut anything, that eventually you would hit a point where it could cut no more, because what the thing you reached is the smallest thing possible that has no parts. And so kind of a question in physics and metaphysics is, what is the least thing, the thing that you could cut no more? His answer was water. Everything is water. Now looking around, you might say, but wait, you know, there's water, and then there's like backpacks and squirrels and rocks and dirt and stuff that's not water. And why I think it's water? Well, the problem with the one and the many here is essentially this. If you believe there's like one thing, how does that one thing become the many things? How does water, you know, which we think of normally as being like liquid or, you know, vapor or you know, ice, how does it become things like backpacks and shoes and, you know, glasses and dirt and so on? And do you believe that it did? Here's kind of the story. First, why think that stuff is water? Well, one good reason is this. What happens if you don't get any water of any type for a long time? You dehydrate, and then you die. So water is critical to life. Also, if you dig deep enough in the ground, eventually you hit water. And of course, before they had microscopes, when water would evaporate, you know, like on the coast, it leaves behind a residue. Now, of course, we now know there's, you know, stuff like salt and water that was left behind, but that back then they didn't know that. And so it seemed that water could transition. It could become solid, you know, obviously solid, liquid, and gas, and it seemed to do all that stuff, be really important. So he said, water it is. And he believed that it could, you know, transform. And it clearly can. You know, water becomes a rock, you know, very cold. It's molten. It's kind of cool in a way. We're drinking, you know, molten rock when you drink water. Of course, it doesn't seem so cool. You just think of it as water, but it's literally molten rock. And so the idea being that it can switch those forms. And this has gotten scientists and philosophers going ever since, trying to figure out what's the one thing or things that make up all of the things. Now, another problem we get into was a problem of permanence and change. And the problem is this. Stuff seems to change, but if stuff's going to change, stuff also has to stay the same. Because if it didn't stay the same, at least some of it, it would be destruction rather than change. Now, a couple later philosophers, they took the view that there's one or the other. There's a philosopher, super dead, named Parmenides, which sounds like a cheese, but if you're at a restaurant and someone says, would you like some Parmenides on your pasta? Say no, because otherwise they'd sprinkle a dead philosopher on your pasta, but you don't want to eat that, that's for sure. Probably terrible, or maybe good, either way, probably not. Now, Parmenides said, change is an illusion, nothing changes. Now, the obvious reply is, although it, you know, sometimes it feels like nothing changes, it does seem that things do change. But he had several clever arguments as to why things don't change. Now, there's another philosopher, also dead, but also kind of famous, is a guy named Heraclitus. He believed the world was fire, metaphorically and literally, and everything changed. There was no permanence. One of his quotable quotes was, "You can never step in the same river twice." Because if you jump in the river and hop out and then jump back in, all the water has flowed on. It's a different river now. Now, as we'll see in the future, Plato basically tried to find a middle ground between these two positions. He said change is real, permanence is real, and he finds a way to reconcile those, and tries to. And Thales is the guy that got these problems going, and people are still fighting with them to this day. So in addition to this stuff, what else did Thales contribute? Well, first, he was, as far as we have evidence for, the first monist. Now, monism is a philosophical view that there's one type of thing, one metaphysical, ontological type. And for him, of course, it's water. It's one thing. Now, there are other views we'll see throughout the course of the course, such as dualism, that there's two types of things. And you could have, like, you could go to, like, octoism or, anything. But typically, philosophers tend to stick to, like, there's one thing or two basic things. Although, in theory, no limit. You could have, like, lots of stuff. So he's, as far as you know, the first monist. He's also, as far as the evidence goes, the first materialist or physicalist. Now, in everyday life, if someone claims to be very materialistic, what does that mean about them? They like what? Yeah, material goods. They like nice stuff. Now, philosophical materialists, they probably like nice stuff, because who doesn't like nice stuff? But what makes them what they are is they believe that all that there is to this one thing, because they're monists, that it's material, it's physical, it's it's not incorporeal or spiritual, it's material stuff. And so he was a monist, it's one thing, and he's a materialist, it's made of matter, and of course for him it's water. Now today we know it's not all water, because water is made up of stuff, which is made up of stuff, which is made up of stuff. But, good start, gotta start somewhere. Now, in addition to all this other stuff, he also added a couple other important things. First, he laid out the value of theoretical understanding. Now, one of the battles that's always been waged is between learning, knowing for the sake of knowing, knowledge for knowledge's sake, and knowing for purely practical reasons, to be able to, make money, kill people, bake bread, STEM stuff. Now, Thales believed that understanding, grasping things, if you couldn't do practical things with it, had worth. This is not to say Thales didn't do practical things. He actually did a lot of stuff, and a lot of things, but he valued theoretical understanding. Now, you could take the view that theoretical understanding eventually leads to practical stuff. For example, we can trace the theory of atoms back to, Democritus, and way back to Thales, the idea that stuff is made of stuff. And of course, this understanding of atoms has given us things like, nuclear power, nuclear weapons, very practical. And so you could argue that theoretical understanding eventually pays off. Or you could argue that just understanding stuff is worthwhile. It's not good for anything, it's just simply something good to have, just to understand it. Or so he claims. But it's an interesting question. Is knowing things worth it if you can't do anything useful with it? Lastly, one battle, of course, in society in general, and philosophy and science in particular, is how much you should yield to authority. Now, in certain parts of philosophical and scientific history, typically cases where stagnation is occurring, people, for the most part, scientists and philosophers, simply defer to authority and tradition. During the Middle Ages, for example, they typically deferred to the authority of Aristotle and for science and the church, which is why science did make a lot of progress. And Aristotle's a pretty smart guy, but for, quite some time, thousand years, people kind of deferred to Aristotle, which means people were not out doing new science. Now, what happened with Thales, and what happens when you have periods of revolution, is that people say we shouldn't just follow tradition and authority, we should think for ourselves, we should investigate. And this leads to periods of, as you might imagine, upheaval, chaos, overturning of old traditions and authority, new discoveries, new inventions, new social orders. So you see, for example, the Renaissance, when Europe comes out of the Dark Ages, you see it during the Enlightenment, you see it in the American Revolution, and then you get stagnation again, appeal tradition and authority, then rebellion again. And so Thales got it going with the idea that if you're going to do real science and philosophy, you just can't go, well, this is what we've always done, and this is what the people in charge say. And then we'll see philosophy stagnate, and then the next big revolution was with our good friend, people like Descartes and Locke, really rebelling. And then it got all stagnant again. We're still waiting for our next rebellion. Now we're heading towards Socrates and Plato, probably the most famous dead philosophers. But before we get to them, we've got to talk a bit about the sophists, which are relevant historically, but also relevant today. Sophists never left, and now they're probably stronger than they've been since the time of Socrates. Now, Socrates was Socratizing, and many philosophers were philosophizing in Athens and in that area. And the reason is because Athens was a major power. It was a city-state, which is literally what it sounds like. Imagine if you had a city that was also its own country. There are many Greek city-states, and they all recognized, they had a similar language and a similar culture, and they all recognized themselves as Greeks, but they would fight each other. Famously Athens and Sparta, with war. But if someone else came along, say like the Persians, they would fight them. But if they ran out of other people to fight, they'd fight themselves. Because why not? Now, during this time period when Socrates was Socratizing, before and after, it was an age of gold. Athens was the top of its game. It was a major military power, had a strong fleet, a strong army, a strong economy. It was a leading center of learning and culture and commerce. Basically like a little tiny, metaphorically speaking, United States, kind of like the position we're in, a world power. But of course, trouble was on the horizon, as it always is. Now, it was also an age of irony, because even though Athens was in a way top of its game, it was also a time of dissent, of cultural malaise, of disrespect for authority, a time of social concerns. In other words, exactly what's going on now. We're kind of like at the peak of our game, but of course we have all kinds of problems. And this is something that goes throughout history, which is why history is actually a really important thing to know, because the same, people remain basically the same, and we keep doing the same stuff. Because if you do the same stuff, you get the same results. And we're doing the same stuff. So what caused Athens to end up in this scenario, and what gave us these sophists? Well, this will seem very familiar. First, traditional authority had weakened. Now we're seeing that today in the United States. For example, how powerful is the church today? All churches in general. Do they rule with an iron fist like they used to back in the Middle Ages? No, we have scandals. People are still religious, but the power of the church has been somewhat diminished. And of course, how do people feel about the media today? The mainstream media. Yeah, it's kind of. How many people trust the news? How many of you trust the news, like CNN, they get it right. And Fox, they get it right. Yeah, we have a lot of distrust of those institutions. And so, in schools are wrought with scandals. I went to Ohio State during that, fortunately I didn't encounter that doctor. Went to the same clinic where he was at, but did not have an encounter with him, which is good. Universities have scandals, etc. And so traditional authority is weakening, just like, happened then. Relativism is also being embraced. The idea that truth is based on the culture. And we see people endorsing that today. For example, we have Rita Giuliani saying on national TV something like, the truth is not the truth. We have people talking about alternative facts, which is essentially relativism. There is no truth. And so, happened back then, happening in today. Now we all, of course, do have democracy, mostly, which is good. We also have individualism, which can also be good. Because one thing that's a hallmark of the West is that people look out mostly for who? Yeah, themselves, which need not be terrible, unless people get too out of control. Now there's also skepticism, people doubting things. There's the everyday sense of skepticism. Like if someone says, I'm skeptical about that, what do they mean? Like a normal, everyday use. Yeah, they're not sure. Now philosophically, as we'll see in the future, a skeptic is someone who claims we don't have knowledge, that we can't know things. And it can get pretty extreme. We'll see the most extreme in Descartes. Today, of course, again, if you tied it to, back to relativism, skepticism is a view. People doubt, what they see. Weirdly, people tend to doubt the truth more than things that are not true. They tend to embrace things that are, kind of clearly absurd and reject things that are true. Also, of course, practicality. One shift we often see in cultures is going from, say, very religious and spiritual to very practical focused. And religion never totally vanishes, the spiritual never totally vanishes, but people tend to focus more on, stuff here and now. And interestingly, religion often kind of transitions to that. So there's, for example, today, sort of like old style religion, but there's also the gospel of prosperity, which tells you what? What does the gospel of prosperity promise you? Yeah, prosperity. If you believe hard enough, or send the right amount of money to the pastor, someone will become rich. That part is true. Yes, the idea being that people are much more focused on practical stuff. We have this manifesting today. We have the Governor Scott saying people shouldn't study anthropology, which his daughter, of course, studied, so gives an idea why he's mad about that. She does have a job though, so she does work. Anthropology actually is pretty good placement. It's pretty, all majors are pretty high. The idea though that we should focus on STEM and not waste time on things like art and history and especially philosophy. So a very practical view. Now, also when you've got a democracy, the way to have power is to sway the masses and get them to vote. And so we have in ancient Athens something that would be, very familiar to us today. I mean, sure, the language would be different, the clothes, all that other stuff would be different, but the basic social problems and issues and so forth are the same ones we encounter today. Now into this scenario arose the sophists. Now, in general, being called a sophist is an insult, especially if someone wants to insult a philosopher and they don't want to use like 4-letter words, they'll use the term sophist. It's, probably the worst insult, besides, obscenities that one can use against a philosopher. So if you really want to make a philosopher angry, just call them a filthy sophist. That's the way to start stuff up. Now, to be fair, the sophists do in some ways get kind of a bad rep. And the reason why they have kind of a bad reputation is because we learn about them primarily from Socrates and Plato, and they were the enemy of Socrates and Plato. So to be fair to the sophists, we have to consider that much of the stuff we hear about them comes from their opponents. So it'd be kind of like judging Hillary Clinton based on what Donald Trump has said about her. So you'd probably think she is far more terrible than she is. Or think like about anybody about based on what social media says about them. Typically it'd be, people say much more horrible things than people typically are. So the sophists arose into this. So what were they? And what are they? Well, the sophists embraced the following stuff. First, sort of somewhat ironically in a way, they did hold philosophical positions. So they did, think this through. First off, they were skeptics. Their view was, you can't know stuff. Now, they varied in their degree of skepticism, but in general, their belief was you couldn't know stuff about values. Now, kind of a rough English version would be nomos, from which we get our term norms, like social norms or normative stuff. Or we also get our term normal, which means just like everybody else. In physics, not misspelled, this is kind of the Greek style version in English. Physics would be the, as it says, the physical stuff. Now, the sophists typically weren't skeptical about that. So if you talk to a typical typical sophist, hey, how about this fire? Does that burn? They'd say, yeah, that burns. Or like if you jump off a building, would that like hurt? They'd say, yeah, that would hurt. But if you ask them about, morality, etc., and said, well, is this really wrong or right? They'd say, well, you don't know. Now, they also embrace relativism, which is the view that if there is truth, then it would vary from culture to culture, context to context. And again, this is something that's to show how this is still around today. When Kellyanne Conway started talking about alternative facts and talking about these different views, and Giuliani talking about truth is not truth, I was like, wow, the sophists have come back and they're in power. Because the key component of being a sophist is embracing this relativism. Now, there are people who are relativists who aren't sophists. So just because someone's a relativist doesn't mean they're a sophist. So what more do you need more than relativism? Well, the hallmark of sophists is this. Because they believe that there is no objective morality, there is no truth about morality, and everything is very flexible and culturally dependent, there's a practical problem of, well, if there is no good, if there is no bad, if there is no wrong, if there is no right, then if there's no real truth, then what do? You still got to fill up the day with stuff. They didn't have Netflix back then, so what do? Well, their answer was this. What matters is success. Or to use a Trumpism, winning. Winning is what matters. So what the sophists would do, and they were typically paid teachers, they would advertise, in return for money, they would teach people. Teach people what? Well, they teach people these lessons. There is no morality, there's no good or bad, right or wrong, there is no real truth. What matters is success. And the way you achieve success in ancient Athens was swaying the masses. So they would teach people how to be persuasive, how to use rhetoric, how to sway the populace, so they would vote and give you power. So that way you could be successful. So the hallmark of sophism is that. I mean, it does have a philosophy behind it, namely, you can't know, truths, all the stuff about values, ethics, and wrong and right, that's all relative. So what you should focus on is success. Now, they did have a couple variations here when it came to morality. One type of sophist would tell people, okay, look, yeah, there's no right or wrong, there's no good or bad, adultery, that's not good or bad, stealing, that's not good or bad, lying, not good or bad, but if you go in, suppose like the sophist is advising you, they would say if you go and do all this stuff, then people will think badly. So, act like the norms of society, that way you're able to, keep your power to sway people. And that was kind of the tradition in politics, fairly recently. But you didn't really know if a politician really is like a good person or not. But typically, would politicians try to behave like not get caught doing adultery? Typically, yeah. I mean, they still do it, but they didn't really get caught. And sometimes it would cost them. Gary Hart, probably never heard of him because adultery. There was the guy, Sanford, who was walking the Appalachian Trail down to Argentina to commit adultery. He got in trouble. It was funny having Trump mocking adultery guy. And then, so some politicians, it does stick, like, or the guy, Weiner, the New York City guy, he, didn't even commit adultery, he was just sending, pics of himself, and he got in trouble. And so, like, the sophist tell him, so the sophist is advising someone like Weiner or Sanford to say, don't do that stuff. Not because it's wrong, but because if they do it, they'll lose their job. Where's Gary Hart now? I don't know, maybe he's dead. I think he's dead. Not because of the scandal, but because he's old. That Weiner guy, he's done. He's not gonna get involved. He tried to come back, but he just screwed it up again, so he's done. That Stanford guy, he came back kind of, but he's done. And so for many politicians, they should have heeded the sophist's advice. Don't do that stuff not because it's bad, but because you're not gonna succeed. And similarly with like some of the celebrities who got in trouble. They used to be able to get away with all that stuff. And now a sophist would say, it's like, look, touching your employees, coercing them, that's neither good nor bad, because no good or bad, but don't do it because you'll get fired. Just wait a while, people forget about it, you can go back to, doing that again, because just like in the 90s, there was a big anti-harassment campaign, and people got bored and forgot about it, and then now we're shocked that, people are terrible. It's like, yeah, they've been doing that for a while. Now, the second type of sophist is even more cunning. Their view is, do all the stuff you want to do. Because, there's no good or bad, so why not if you want to do it, adultery, stealing, etc. But don't get caught. So one version of the sophist is, don't do that stuff because you'll get caught and you'll get in trouble. You'll lose your job or your power. The more cunning version, I guess for pros, is, yeah, if you can get away with that, go for it. Because what matters is success. Why be restrained by the foolishness of the masses, because there's no good or bad, so go for it. Just don't get caught. Or if you get caught, be able to handle it. Now, Trump is a brilliant example of this, because, it is impressive. Things that would have, adultery, that sunk, many a politician. Trump gets in a little trouble, people are like, yeah, whatever, porn stars, no big deal. Lying, getting caught up in lies, people, if you remember back in 2016, people kept saying, he's done. You're caught in this big lie, he's done. But no, he just kept on going through it. And he's still doing it today. And so Trump is like that super pro in this regard, because he can do all the stuff, violate all the norms, and still be successful. So, and not surprisingly, the people around him, like Kellyanne Conway, etc., are pretty clearly sophists, because they get on there and they say things like, well, there is no truth, there's alternative facts. And Trump's defense is always, he is winning. He's winning. He's got success. And people defending him say, well, he's successful. Look how successful he is. What about the lying, the adultery, etc.? Success. So we are back in the age of sophism. Never left. It just kind of changes form. So the sophists were really important because, firstly, from the philosophical standpoint, they were the joker to the Socrates and Plato, Batman and Robin. You got to have a good, as any writer knows or movie director knows, you can't have a hero without a villain. You got to have your villain. And so the sophists were a great villain for Socrates and Plato. In addition to their villainy, They also made other important contributions to logic, to rhetoric, and they also required philosophers to be on their game, to respond to skepticism, relativism, and to battle over what counts as success. And as I mentioned, they never left. They're in power now, putting forth that line. And so they contributed a great deal and are in charge. They are running the show. Now the reason why philosophers worry about that is because of this. Because if someone has no moral values and all that matters is success, what are the things they won't do? And the answer is nothing. They have no limits. And Bob Woodward's book coming out, not commercial, I'm not going to buy it because you can just hear about it. That's terrible. I should buy it. He makes a claim that Trump is amoral, and again, this is classic sophism. Sophists they don't believe in good or evil. They believe there is no morality. And the word from the standpoint of people who do have values other than success, they worry that view is dangerous, because if you have no moral compass and all that is succeeding, one can do all kinds of terrible things, which is a major philosophical debate. Is there such a thing as objective good or bad, which is under debate, and if there is, then amoralism would be a problem. However, if the sophists are right, then this is what the best you can expect. Well, not the best you can expect, but exactly what you can expect. People pretending to be good, and you could say, well, Trump is at least honest about it. People say Trump always says what he means, and in a way that's kind of true. He doesn't. He just comes out and says what he's going to do, and what matters is when. So this is actually a pretty good example of the sort of contest between the idea of objective morality, values, etc., and success and relativism playing out at the national level. So, this stuff's still relevant. Now we now turn to our good dead friend Socrates, or Socrates, as he was called in Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure. He was born in 470, died in 399, and is of course still dead today. One of the reasons Socrates got into trouble was because of this thing in his backstory. One of Socrates' friends went to the Oracle of Delphi, and Delphi is still there. You can actually go and see the ruins where the Oracle was, and the Oracle endured for about 1,000 years, which is a pretty good run. Now, back in the ancient days of Socrates, they didn't have, Google, etc. So if you wanted answers, you'd go see an oracle. And what the oracle would do is they claimed they could somehow connect to the gods. And you ask them a question, like if I go to war against Persia, what will happen? And they would give an appropriately obscure and cryptic answer, kind of the ones you often see in movies. The oracle always gives some prophecy where it's really unclear. It's like, why don't you just tell us? What are we gonna do? Why does it have to be so obscure? One famous example is a king went to the oracles and said, I wish to go to war with the Persians. What will happen? And the oracle said, a great empire will be destroyed. A great kingdom will be destroyed. He's like, great. Of course, the irony is that it was his kingdom that was destroyed, which is why you always have to ask those follow-up questions. So Socrates' friend goes to the oracle and says, Oracle, I need to know who is the wisest of all. And the oracle consults the gods and says, Socrates. Socrates is the wisest of men. And he comes back and says, Soc, guess what? Socrates says, I don't know, what? And he says, guess who's the wisest of men? Who could it be? He says, you, Socrates, you are the wisest. Socrates says, me? I can't be the wisest. So Socrates doesn't think he's the wisest. Now, if for some reason you didn't think you were the wisest, or in some other field like the best, what would you do? How would you prove the gods wrong?
Compete, I guess, what they call this?
Yeah, compete. And if you find someone, wiser, then the gods were wrong. And so right off the bat, Socrates is basically committing, some kind of a bit of blasphemy. Because the god said, hey, Socrates, you're the wisest. And he says, I'm not going to believe you gods. I'm going to go out and prove you wrong. It's already getting in trouble. So what he does is he sets out, Blues Brother style, on a mission from the gods. And he's trying to find someone wiser. So he goes to the poets and tries to find wisdom there, and finds they don't know anything. And he goes to the politicians and finds out they're the worst. The ones that think of themselves as the best, he finds they are the most terrible. And then he goes to the craftspeople and finds, although they know how to make stuff and do stuff, they think they know far more than they do. So he comes to the conclusion that the gods were right, that he, Socrates, is the wisest because he knows that he knows nothing, that his wisdom amounts to nothing. Now, as you might imagine, people have been debating ever since what he means by that. And the general consensus is that since he went on to say a whole lot about nothing, that doesn't mean that he literally knows nothing at all, that he has no knowledge. His view is that he knows so little compared to what is not known that his wisdom amounts to nothing. And essentially, the key to being wise is that realization that one doesn't know anything. Now, one day it would seem like really simple, like how you just say, "Oh, I don't know nothing," super wise. But the challenge is actually accepting it, because people generally think they know everything. I did. I remember when I went to, I was that annoying person. Every time the professor had a question, hand was up, my mouth was going. That was terrible. And I thought I knew everything. And then the more I learned, as the saying goes, the more I learned that I did not know. And I mean, I obviously read, Socrates said, "Oh yes, I know nothing," but secretly I believed I still knew everything. And of course, if a person thinks they know everything or know things, they can't learn. They don't listen. So if you're talking to someone, they think, if they think they know everything you're going to say, they're not listening to you. And most conversations, people spend not listening, but thinking more what they're going to say next. So Socrates does seem to be right. And when a person realizes they don't know, that's when they can start learning stuff. Now there is the question of the real Socrates, because we don't actually have any Socrates' writings. His own view was, you don't write philosophy, you drink and talk about philosophy. So what we think we know about Socrates comes from what Plato and others said about it. Now, Plato, as we'll see, wrote a lot of dialogues. In many of them, Socrates is the main character. They're kind of like plays, characters talking. Now, the people who are experts on Plato and Socrates think that the dialogues Plato wrote early on are probably genuine Socrates, probably, pretty accurate. Because Plato claims that his dialogues are not written by him, they're basically transcriptions. He claims that he, just took notes or memorized what was going on or got accounts of it, and is just transcribing these dialogues. Now, with the stuff Plato wrote early on, there's definitely particular views presented by Socrates, and again, most of the experts say, yeah, that's probably the real Socrates. But the dialogues Plato wrote later in his life, Socrates' views change from the earlier dialogues, and they become much more like Plato's. So the experts think that the dialogues Plato wrote later are less Socrates and much more Plato, maybe no Socrates at all. Now, in terms of the reason why I mentioned written later or earlier is because he wrote some dialogues that are set in terms of when the events occurred that are later. For example, the Apology takes place right before Socrates dies. The next one is the Crito. But it's an early dialogue. He wrote it pretty early on. And then some of the dialogues Plato wrote quite a bit later, they're set much earlier in Socrates' life. So the early dialogues is two versions of early and late. One is in Socrates' timeline, when did the events take place, and the other is when Plato was writing them, when did he write them. So it's kind of like with the Star Wars movies. Some of them were written, you know, some of the ones that were written earlier took place later, and some of the ones that were written later took place earlier. But unlike with the Star Wars, pretty much all the dialogues are pretty good, well, philosophically speaking. There is no Phantom Menace dialogue in there. Now, Socrates, as I mentioned, was an enemy of the sophists. He also, his main opponents were the sophists, who believed, you know, everything is relative, all that matters is success. He was also a foe of the poets. And the reason why he was a foe of the poets was not because he believed that they were so much relativists, but he believed that the poets were corrupting. In the Republic, Book 10, Socrates makes his famous argument, still used to this day, by people who want to censor him, that exposure to the wrong sort of art is corrupting. And when people talk about like violent video games making people violent, they're just using the argument Socrates gave. They may not realize it, but that's his argument, that exposure to corrupting art corrupts you, exposure to violence makes you violent, etc. And so he believed that the poets were morally dangerous. But he considered the sophists probably his deadliest enemies. Now, Socrates believed that ignorance was the worst thing. Now, and he thought the worst ignorance of all was ignorance of ignorance, because ignorance is bad, but a person not knowing they don't know, that's the worst of all. And he does seem right, because what gets people in the most trouble seems to be when they think they know what they're doing, but they really have no idea at all. So next time we'll turn to more Socrates, so a good rest of the day, and I'll see you on the next one.